Welcome. Thank you very much for joining me this morning. Appreciate you coming out nice and early on the last day of the conference. So, I'm excited to talk to you this morning about one of my favorite areas of IT security, and that's PAM. So, a PAM program should be a very important part of your security strategy. But when I talk to my peers, I often hear that it's an area that's underfunded and under-resourced. So today I'm going to try to give you some tips to help you get more out of your PAM program with the resources you have, and hopefully some of these will resonate with you and you can take them back and try them with your team. So let's get started. Here's a little bit about me and my journey to PAM. So I started out as a Unix system admin, working on one of the largest CAD server farms at Ford Motor Company. And my role often crossed over into the area of security. So in 2007, I actually joined the security team and started learning about identity, MFA, SSO, and then eventually they brought in a PAM tool. And so since about 2010, I've been working on PAM projects in large organizations. So the title of this talk is to jumpstart your PAM program, and there's a couple ways you can interpret that. It could be that you haven't started yet, or you're getting ready to launch one, and you need some tips on how to get started. Or you could already have a PAM program that's hopelessly stuck in the mud, and this happens for numerous reasons. It could be that your PAM engineers have taken on other roles in the company or moved on to different companies. It could bring your security team might have brought in PAM to solve a specific use case, and then once that box was checked, they moved on to whatever the next shiny blinky thing is that they wanted to work on. But no matter where you are in your journey, I think I've got some tips that can help get you unstuck. So here's the agenda, but at a high level, the first two items are to help people that are new to PAM to kind of get them up to speed, and then the remaining items are to some of the things that I thought were important issues to talk about today and interesting things to bring up. So let's get started here. So since this is Identiverse, I actually think that most of you probably are familiar with what a PAM tool is. But to help out people that might be new to this, let's answer a few questions. But before I answer this question, I'm going to actually answer, what is a privileged account? And at a really high level, a privileged account is used by, say, system administrators. They could be human or non-human to do privileged actions. Those actions are things like creating user access or removing user access, configuring software, installing software, creating databases, all kinds of privileged things. But because those accounts have those privileges, they're often attractive to attackers. So we need a way to secure those and protect them in your organization. And that's where the PAM tool comes in. So a PAM tool, people typically think of it as the traditional use case where it's a password vault, or it's some place to store passwords and manage them. And while that's true, the modern PAM tools actually do much, much more. And we could do probably a whole bunch of different talks and sessions on all the different features in a PAM tool. But to answer this question at a high level, we're going to say a PAM tool is a place where you're going to store your most critical credentials in your environment. And so I think that's a good spot. All right, so what is a PAM service then? Well, the PAM service is that tool that you're probably going to purchase from a vendor, and then all the processes that integrate it into your environment. And that's important because the tool itself doesn't do you much good if you don't have all these additional integrations hooked to it. And so I listed out some of the building blocks of a PAM service here, and we're actually going to get into more detail on these in the following slides. So one of the things before you get your PAM service up and running is you need to think about your enterprise policies, and they're going to drive adoption of your PAM program. So what I mean by that is you need to define what is a privileged account in your environment, because it actually varies from company to company. There's certain accounts like, say, root and administrator in Windows that people mostly agree that these are privileged accounts. But other accounts kind of fall into gray areas. So you need a good definition in your policy of what should be a privileged account, and then you be willing to update that policy as things change. Another policy that you need to have is how are you going to manage those privileged accounts? What are the controls that are going to be in place? Do they need additional layers of approval? How do you rotate them? How often? What's the complexity? So those are things that are in your policies. But in addition to policies, another design consideration is the resiliency of your product. And so what I mean by that is that you're going to be holding the most critical things in your environment, and they're essentially the keys to the kingdom. And so your tool needs to work well at all times. It needs to be available, but especially for those use cases when there's a problem. So make sure that you can take that into your design plans. Okay, so the first thing you want to do with your PAM service is actually get out and promote it, advertise it. Hop into your Bluesmobile here and get the word out. Explain to your company what is PAM and how you're going to use it. Make the users comfortable with how it's going to be in their environment and how it might change their jobs. You're going to need to clean up your CMDB, and if you're not familiar with the CMDB, it is, it's a database where you store information about the components and devices in your network and in your environment. And the reason why this is critical is because you're going to need a source of truth for that information for a lot of the automation that you're going to build in your PAM tool. And then this last piece, study your environment. And what I mean by that is schedule interviews with the different teams that are going to be using your PAM tool and that are impacted by it. Talk to the people that are actually hands-on keyboard and find out how they're using those credentials in your environment, because you're not going to know unless you're talking to them. And then the great thing is when you're having these discussions with them, you'll actually find out about use cases that you probably didn't even know about, and you can add that to your list of things to do. Okay, so there's a couple planning things here listed here. So obviously, as you're starting up, you do need to define some goals and a roadmap. And the roadmap will be important as you move forward. We'll actually talk about that some more on some future slides. But the second bullet is something that's really important, is that since you're integrating with all these other pieces of your environment, you're going to need support from all these other teams. You're going to need time from your identity team and from these application teams. And so it's real important that you start having those discussions up front so that they get some expectation of what's going to happen. You don't want to blindside people and say, hey, I need a couple weeks of your time to help me with this integration when they've already got things on their plate. And then the last thing, inventory. This is actually something that you can start even before you have a PAM tool in place. You need to inventory, where are my privileged accounts? What servers are they on? Who's using them? And the important thing here is that inventory needs to be automated. If it's a static inventory, it's going to be out of date the day after you finished it. So figure out a way to automate that inventory. And like I said, you can get started on that at any time. So here's some things for designing your PAM service. You need to understand the life cycles of all these things that are going to be impacted. So you need to understand how they're provisioned, how they're deprovisioned, and how they're accessed during that life cycle. And because that's going to be an important part as you're trying to decide how to manage those accounts in your PAM tool. Make sure you're reducing risks. And so here's an example. Storing a static password in your PAM tool, well, it's probably better than having it in a spreadsheet somewhere. But really, unless you're managing that password and rotating it and have some controls about it, you really haven't reduced any risk. You've just checked the box that, hey, I've got this in my PAM tool. And so you definitely want to try to avoid doing that. And then this last bullet on project management, project managers sometimes get a bad press, but I would say a good project manager is definitely an asset. The reason is that there's so many moving parts here to keep track of. There's, there's the cats. You need to herd the cats and get people to come to meetings and things like that, and hold them accountable for deliverables. And there's just really a lot of things to keep track of. And your technical engineers on your PAM team, they're not going to want to do this. This is not things that they like to do. So I definitely would recommend getting some project management involved in building out your PAM service. All right, so now we're going to talk about onboarding accounts. And so I recommend that you follow a risk-based approach. And so this is going to vary from company to company. What is a high-risk application in one company may not be that way for another company. So there's some that are pretty common. I think if you have an on-prem Active Directory, that's pretty high risk. So you want to onboard that into your PAM tool. There's probably some applications that fall into that category also, or even things like social media accounts. They might not take down your company, but they could ruin your reputation if they fall into the wrong hands. So definitely look at the risk, rate what you're going to try to onboard, and look at the risk levels, and so that you can prioritize. So in managing application credentials, it's always difficult because you have to spend a lot of time with your app teams to figure out how to best manage the credential, whether it can be rotated, how it can be rotated, whether they're going to have to change any code to actually make that work. And so just be prepared to spend that time with them and work through some of those things. And it's always, one of the things I'm always interested in is those challenging accounts that seem impossible to manage. The problem is that you could end up spending a lot of time on that. It could be a time sink, and this is where looking at the risk-based approach helps you make some decisions there. Like, I don't want to spend a couple weeks trying to figure out how to manage an account for some really tough application if it's not really that high of a risk for my organization. Okay, here's some more ideas for the kind of the maintenance of your system. One of the things that I really recommend is putting together some metrics. Your management's going to want to see some return on investment, show that you're actually improving the security posture. So you definitely want to plan for that and make sure you have something ready for them. Monitoring and audit, those are things that you're going to have to add to your service also. The audit part, we could have another whole session talking about all the aspects of audit. But really, they're going to want to know how the accounts are being used. So some of that stuff you can pull out of reports and make it available, or make the tool available for them to pull reports themselves. As far as your roadmap goes, you'll have opportunities to improve that as you move forward and learn how things are being done in your organization. So definitely do quarterly reviews, keep your roadmap up to date so that management can see what you're doing there. The operational maintenance, what I'm talking about there is, when your head's down trying to onboard a bunch of applications, sometimes it's easy to lose track that your PAM tool needs to be patched, or the operating system it runs on needs to be patched. There's all kinds of operational maintenance that still needs to be done, so don't fall behind on those things. So one of the things while you're working on your roadmap is consider building a maturity model. These can go hand in hand. And if you're not familiar about maturity models, you can think of them as a way to identify gaps in your service, things that you might want to focus on to put on your roadmap for future focus or future budgetary needs. The vendors in the PAM space, they have maturity models that you can take a look at and kind of help you make some decisions. But here's the thing, is that maturity models are often criticized because of how you can adapt them to your organization. It's sometimes difficult. And that's why I say you really need to look at multiple maturity models and then kind of combine some of the ideas from them to figure out how you should use it in your organization and customize it, like the mutt cut band here. So make it your own. The vendors don't know your organization as well as you do. So you can pick and choose from different pieces and pull that all together. And then if it's not working out for you, you can trade it in for a mini bike like they did in the movie. So in June of 2018, I actually did a presentation at Identiverse where I talked about some different PAM things, but I spent a lot of time talking about maturity models. And the sample model is still out there in GitLab if you want to take a look. But what I really recommend is that you get those models from the vendors, your vendor, other vendors in the PAM space, and really, like I said, kind of merge the ideas and figure out what do you need for your organization to get some benefit out of this. All right, so PAM automation. So I highly recommend building an automation server. And and what I mean by that is have a place where you can run all of your automation utilities as well as the administration scripts that your engineers like to build. And so every PAM tool has a GUI, but your engineers are probably going to build their own scripts to interact with the API because, one, it's faster and it's repeatable, and that's what engineers like to do. So it's important to give them one place to run all these things. And so there's a couple benefits there. Well, one reason is that it gives you one place to secure and harden, because these scripts could be attractive to attackers, could be used for recon. So you definitely want to make sure that they're well protected and not just spread out on everyone's laptop. But then the second reason that's a good thing is that it gives you a place to help onboard new engineers. So when they come in, you can point them to your automation server, say, hey, here's the scripts, here's what you need to run. They'll be productive much faster. And I listed out some ideas here for some automation ones, but one that I want to call out is the account discovery one. Every PAM tool, all the modern PAM tools have account discovery built into it. But what I've found is that they typically only work well for like standard use cases. And every single place that I've been at, we've always had to create our own discovery tools to kind of supplement what the built-in ones were. And so I think that has always been something that's been, definitely paid off and been really important for us to have. All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about account management. And I'm going to suggest that you reduce the number of privileged accounts. And so I'm talking about following a shared account model, and this doesn't work in all situations, but it works in many, and I think you can see the benefits if you think through it. So let me give you an example. Say you're working with an app team and they've got 10 engineers on it, or 10 administrators. So what do you do today? Well, you create 10 privileged accounts and put it in your vault so that they can use them. But as you interview them, maybe you find out that only 2 of the engineers use their accounts on a daily basis, and all the other ones just need occasional access or just need it for an emergency. So if you move to a shared account model, you could actually reduce the number of accounts from 10 to maybe 2 or 3. You put them in your vault, and the engineers can check it out when they need it, and it's available for them. So it makes it much easier to manage. And also, when your engineers rotate, as someone leaves the company, someone else comes back in, basically you're just adding them to a group to get the privileged account, and you're not having to manage and re-provision them. But let me take this a step further, is that in the previous example, I said, well, let's reduce the number of privileged accounts. But now I'm actually going to suggest that maybe you might need to create more privileged accounts, but just with less privilege. And so thinking back on that example, we talk to the engineers and we find out that maybe they only need one account with the full privileges, right? Because the rest of the time they're just doing day-to-day business functions. That function might be start and stopping services, so they can patch stuff. So we'll just create an account that only has those privileges and put that in the vault for them. Or they might just need to run some type of metrics, so we'll just create an account that only does that. And then so forth and on, until we take care of all the functions that they need. So maybe we're back up to 10 accounts. Maybe we're actually more than 10 accounts. But the important piece here is that all those accounts have much less privilege than that one that had the full privileges. And if they're ever compromised, there's not a lot that people are going to be able to do with it. So from a security posture point of view, it's definitely a much better space. So something to consider when you're working with onboarding these teams. All right. Documentation. Let me tell you a quick story. I went to a session from a guy named Nick Fry, and he was talking about how to build high-performing teams. And Nick Fry, he was a owner and manager of a Formula One racing team in the early 2000s. And he said high-performing teams need documented, now I'm going to mess up his quote, documented detailed plans for every eventuality. There it is. And so I totally agree with it. And so, there's lots of benefits to having good documentation. It's a single source of truth. It records tribe knowledge. But, we tend to avoid doing documentation because we're not good at it. And I think that if you have a good system to follow, you can get better. And so this is one that I've used at a couple different places, so I suggest you take a look at it. There's nothing to buy here. This just teaches you about these 4 types of documentation and how to write it and kind of how to manage it a little bit. So it's something I think you should consider for your team to help build out your documentation. Okay. Executive support is definitely critical for your PAM tool. You're not going to get very far without it. But what's some other ways to overcome obstacles? And so one of the things I think is PAM should be collaborative. You need to work with all these teams that I mentioned earlier that you're going to take time away from other projects. If you're collaborating with them, they're more likely to remove roadblocks instead of introducing them. And definitely build power users in your community. Some of the devs and engineers on teams that are using your tool, they'd be interested in getting some training, and they'll train other people. And then they'll become the go-to people for their organization, so people with questions will ask them first before they come to your PAM team, and hopefully that'll reduce some of your load on your team. All right, lessons learned. I'm getting short on time. I'm just going to talk about one of these lessons. So we've actually talked about all of these at some point, except for the middle one there. See, eat your own dog food. And I highly recommend that. And what does that mean? It means that people aren't going to take you seriously unless you're practicing what you preach. So if you're asking app teams to remove hard-coded credentials from their scripts, don't put hard-coded credentials in your scripts. Your PAM program should be the example of how to do this properly in your environment. So definitely make sure that you're eating your own dog food and following your own source there. Some key takeaways. I said developing effective PAM service is difficult but rewarding, but I would actually say it's actually exciting and rewarding. It's my favorite place of IT security, like I said earlier. You get to work with all the different teams in your environment. You get to work on some really hard problems and come up with solutions. And that's why it's very rewarding. So I think I'm out of time. So thank you very much. I appreciate you joining me this morning. There's my information.
Thank you, Ken, very much. Excellent session, as expected. We do have time for a couple of questions, so raise your hand. I'll bring you the mic.
Thanks so much, Ken. My name is Sabu. I'm from Accenture. You pretty much just summed up my PAM career in the last 7 years.
Awesome.
Well done. I think a couple of key points. I'll make a brief statement and a question. The areas that you hit on for creating or grooming a CMDB and a lack of the CMDB as well as discovery tools for various systems in the environment. So I'll end with the question. Around discovery, you mentioned several of the vendors lack in that area. Could you speak to any broad or specific, let's say for database systems, any good wins or technical ways you've been able to extract such information? Thank you.
Yeah, no, so good questions and good observation. I think as far as discovery for whether it's databases or any of the other applications, difficult things to do in your environment, typically the vendor provided tools, like I said, they're looking at standard use cases. But what happens is that in different organizations, things get implemented differently. Either they use different account names, they use different structures, different OUs, and the vendor provided tools they're not flexible enough to accommodate those things. And that's why I usually end up creating some of my own discovery tools to handle those situations. That make sense, or to answer? Yeah.
Time for one more. Okay, we've got to take her over here.
No, I haven't put any on GitHub just because they belong to my employer, but I should look at some of those things because I think there's opportunities there that you could put together some scripts to help out the community and make it so that my employer wouldn't care about it. So I would definitely look into that. So that's a good suggestion. Thanks.
Ken, thank you very much. Excellent job. Folks, before you leave, I have to ask you, please, go into the conference app, click the hamburger bun icon at the top left, and find the surveys. We really value your feedback, and it helps us deliver a good conference next year. Thank you all for coming. Bye.
Yep. Thank you.